In the evening of July 21st, 1896, many birthday guests collected on Cleveland's public square. They stood next to a gigantic white arch spanning Superior Avenue. The flags of all nations flew high on the arch's parapet, and when the sun set, 1,000 electric lights flickered to life on its summit. As midnight approached, the guests blew whistles and cheered. Cannons boomed and 100 guns offered a birthday salute. The city of Cleveland was 100 years old. A few days later, the women of Cleveland held their own observance of Cleveland's centennial. A year in the planning, the day-long festivities were organized by the Women's Department, a group of 2,000 women who each paid $1 for the privilege of helping. The day began with an 8:15 a.m. mass meeting next to the public square statue of Moses Cleveland. During the afternoon, parade organizers of the department, unaccustomed to appearing in public, rode heavily veiled in horse-drawn carriages. On December 18, 1896, a 35-member Women's Centennial Commission was formed to link the women of 1896 with the women of 1996. The women placed $100 with the Society for Savings, the accumulated amount to be used in 1996. Each woman was to name a successor to replace her within the commission until 100 years had passed. The women sealed a list of their accomplishments during Cleveland's centennial year into an aluminum casket and gave it to the Western Reserve Historical Society for safekeeping. In 1996, this box was to be opened by a direct descendant of a commission member. Mrs. Avery, chairman of the commission's executive committee, placed a letter from the Women's Department to the women of 1996 into the casket. If it were possible to bridge the span of 100 years, how would we reply to that letter with its many questions and concerns for the women who live in 1996? What would we want to show these gentlewomen of 1896 about ourselves, our mothers, our grandmothers, and our great-grandmothers?
We of today reach forth our hands across the gulf of 100 years to yesterday to hold your hands and ours to thank you for our heritage. We thank you for our city of 2 centuries, still prosperous and beautiful, and yet still far from our ideal. But perhaps the changes are significant enough to please you. You wrote that some of your streets were not yet well lighted, some were unpaved, and many were unclean. It took almost 30 years for electricity to win out over gas street lighting. But if we complain about lighting today, it is most often how light pollution from the city keeps us from seeing the stars. In 1996, our streets are paved, and though we have no gargantuan task like the 440 miles of muddy Cleveland roads that needed paving in 1896, we struggle to repair a seemingly endless number of potholes. Euclid Avenue, your main street of 1896, was compared to Paris's Champs-Élysées for its beautiful, stately trees. These later died because of automobile and industry-generated pollution, the so-called black clouds of progress. We now have laws regulating air quality and favoring reforestation. You wrote us of the many unemployed and working poor of your time. Sadly, this is also a problem in 1996, and yet we can be proud of the efforts of many Cleveland women in attempting to solve this problem. Working to end poverty was something that concerned women from Cleveland's earliest days on. Assistance for the sick and poor came from relatives, private individuals, and churches. Women were believed to be well suited to charity work because of their natural nurturing tendencies. Women relief volunteers of the early 19th century visited the homes of the poor. Those deemed worthy were then given donated food or used clothing. Specifically excluded from receiving aid were those who persisted in a criminal course of life or in the use of intoxicating liquors and the willfully idle. Poverty was frequently considered a moral or spiritual failing. Because of this, many religious relief volunteers believed their mission was not only to provide food and clothing, but to provide religious instruction as well. While middle-class women continued to work in poor relief during the Civil War, young immigrant and country girls moved to the city to take factory and sales jobs left behind by men who were sent away to fight. As you know, dear women of 1896, in your time 10,000 women were working in Cleveland. 3/4 of them were domestic servants, laundry workers, dressmakers, and milliners. Women also worked in bakeries, cigar and tobacco plants, garment shops, woolen mills, and paper box factories. The typical work week was 60 hours long. Average pay was $5 per week. Wages earned by daughters were vital to family maintenance and were turned over to mothers. In 1868, when returning Civil War veterans took away the better-paying jobs, a group of middle-class Cleveland women formed the Women's Christian Association to help care for the spiritual, moral, mental, social, and physical welfare of these young girls. They understood that working-class women, without money, voting rights, or social position, could be ignored by factory owners and politicians. Frequently, these women became easy prey for male employers and unscrupulous acquaintances, and while patrons of prostitutes received only a $5 fine, the prostitutes were given 60-day jail sentences. The Cleveland WCA quickly built a boarding house to give young, white working women a wholesome place to live. They also built the Retreat, a home for unwed mothers and for girls who had been sexually compromised. Girls were required to attend Bible class and were given lessons in domestic skills and a good common education so they could support themselves honestly. By 1903, the association, now known as the Young Women's Christian Association, was offering classes in English, typewriting, stenography, sewing, dressmaking, physical education, and Bible study. Because only a very few factory workers had the opportunity to attend the YWCA facility, members also organized women's clubs in Cleveland factories. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was a group of women who declared war on Cleveland saloons because, quote, "There is seen on every hand the devastation of homes and the wreck of women's hopes, and it will be continued so long as mothers' hearts are broken, children's lives blighted, wives tortured and even killed outright by the fiends which the saloon produces," unquote. The Temperance Union built friendly inns where men received cheap room and board. Their residences for women included the Open Door for unwed mothers and a training home for friendless girls, where girls were trained as domestic servants. Temperance workers visited the workhouse, jail, and police station to rescue women and girls in trouble. In 1869, Bishop Lewis Rapp brought the Sisters of the Good Shepherd to Cleveland to establish a Catholic home for wayward girls and fallen but penitent women. Rapid industrialization in the last decades of the 19th century, as well as record levels of immigration, led to increased overcrowding, poverty, corruption, and disease. In the 1890s, Cleveland's population was still 27% foreign-born. 20 years later, Cleveland's Haymarket District was made up of 30 different nationalities. The settlement house movement, founded by Jane Addams in Chicago, became an important way of teaching new immigrants about America and of helping them cope with difficult living and working conditions. For the most part, settlement houses were located in Catholic or Jewish immigrant neighborhoods, but settlement house workers were still middle-class Protestant women, and while the moralizing approach of the missions remained, attitudes to reform had become more progressive. Goodrich House was founded by Flora Stone Mather in 1897. Activities were geared first to German and Irish immigrant women and children, then later to Eastern Europeans, and offered social clubs, singing lessons, a public library extension, and a gymnasium. Workers were proud that in just 1 year, 14,442 baths were taken and 2,015 laundries washed. The settlement's director from 1917 to 1947, Alice P. Gannett, believed Goodrich House helped boys overcome the gang instinct by exposing them to the good things in life. Later, the original immigrant groups were replaced by Appalachians and African Americans moving up from the South. In its present location on East 55th and St. Clair, the house has served people from former Yugoslavia. By World War I, a variety of settlement houses existed in Cleveland. Hiram House served the Jewish community along Lower Woodland, then Italians and later African Americans, as these groups moved into the area. Alta House, named after John D. Rockefeller's daughter, helped the Italian population on Mayfield Road adapt to life in America. East End Neighborhood House served the Hungarians and Slovaks of Buckeye Woodhill. Playhouse Settlement, which later became Karamu House, has long been one of the leading centers of black theater in the U.S. Cleveland Music School Settlement, an outgrowth of Goodrich House, still provides children and adults with musical training. As a young black nurse, Jane Edna Hunter was refused permission to board at Cleveland's YWCA in 1905. After she found herself living in a boarding house run by a family involved in prostitution, she founded the Phyllis Wheatley Association to provide a wholesome home and training for homeless black migrant women from the South. History shows us, dear women of 1896, that you worked hard to try and solve many problems. You wrote that even those who had employment were forced to filch hours for work from hours that should have been given to rest, recreation, and study, and that children were robbed of their childhood. Many women campaigned vigorously to stop this. The 1920s and 30s saw the professionalization of settlement staff through programs such as the School of Applied Social Sciences at Western Reserve University. Women volunteers were replaced by college-trained social workers. Increasingly, funds for the settlement houses were dispersed by industrialists and factory owners through Cleveland's community chest. Some in Cleveland felt that this was an attempt by men in the business community to exert more control over the reform movement which Cleveland's women had worked so hard to build. As you wrote us, dear women of 1896, sometimes it does happen that wealth usurps the throne that worth alone should occupy. Middle-class women also joined the women trade union leaders. Together they sought to effect reform by organizing boycotts of companies that treated working women and children unfairly. Such organizations as the Consumers League of Ohio, the Women's Trade Union League, and the National Child Labor Committee sought to improve working conditions by publishing white lists of employers who met minimum standards. In 1902, Cleveland's two major department stores, Higbee's and Halley's, qualified for the white list, but one wonders how helpful the list was when a living wage was considered to be $8 a week, and yet the pay standard for cash girls was only $2.50 a week, and when children were forced to stand for 9.5 hours a day working in factories. Cleveland garment workers struck manufacturers in 1911, asking for a 50-hour work week, a half-day off on Saturday, overtime pay, observance of legal holidays, and the elimination of charges for the use of machines, electricity, and thread. The 8 largest employers banded together hiring strikebreakers and sending out agitators to incite violence. Many women and girl strikers were arrested for disorderly conduct. Union leaders cited Becky Fisher, with her record of 39 arrests in 11 weeks, as a positive example to other strikers. However, the strike ended with no changes in working conditions. Many were angered that the middle-class club women, who had done so much to help working-class women by forming the YWCA and the settlement houses, sat by passively and watched, as employers refused to arbitrate and insisted upon settling issues by the force of starvation and false arrests and intimidation by hired thugs and sluggers. We still have a long way to go. 100 years later, women still only make 70 cents for each dollar earned by men. In the early part of this, Cleveland's second century, it was becoming clear that women needed the vote if they were ever to enlist the aid of government in solving those problems which you, the women of 1896, cared so deeply about solving. Petitions signed by women who could not vote were all too easy to dismiss. Women in the health field had a struggle similar to that of the garment and factory workers for equitable working conditions. In the 19th century, the sick were nursed to health by family members. Hospitals existed to serve the poor and people without relatives in the area, such as the Civil War wounded. They were thought of as places to die. Caregivers were most often untrained, uneducated men and women. Low pay, a lack of standards, and dismal conditions prevented Cleveland nurses from achieving the goals set for them by Englishwoman Florence Nightingale. Once again, without votes to back up requests to upgrade their profession, letters written by nurses to their legislators were ignored. When, in 1908, nurses at one Cleveland hospital went on a sit-down strike to protest unsatisfactory conditions, the hospital closed for 1 year. Again and again, hospitals tried to keep nursing a low-wage job. In 1923, Frances Payne Bolton helped professionalize nursing with the founding of the School of Nursing at Case Western Reserve University. But as recently as the 1930s Depression, doctors and hospital administrators asked nurses to consider working without pay. It took decades for nurses to finally win their battle for quality standards and fair wages. In 1996, nursing is a well-respected profession in Cleveland and across the country. You wrote, gentlewomen of 100 years ago, that the world of 1896 was a happier place than the world of 1796. In 1996, our world is also a happier place than the world of 100 years ago, and in the United States, in Cleveland, Ohio, many of the people who worked to make this city a more equitable place for everyone were women. In 1848, under common law, all property and earnings of women belonged to their husbands. Women, along with the insane and the convicted criminal, could not sign a legally binding contract. The women's suffrage movement of the mid-19th century fought not only for the vote for women, but also for equal opportunities in jobs and education, and for more equitable divorce and property laws. Although Cleveland hosted a National Women's Rights Convention as early as 1853, by and large, Cleveland's women suffragists were moderate and retiring. In 1911, Cleveland suffrage organizations were reactivated in the hope of amending the state constitution to allow women to vote. Florence Allen, who was later appointed the first female federal judge, spoke to college women around the state. The women of East Cleveland won the municipal vote in 1917 after Florence Allen argued the test case in front of the Ohio Supreme Court. During the First World War, the participation of various women's reform groups was a significant factor in the Allied victory. Cleveland's YWCA housed a unit of the Women's Land Army and ran a clubhouse for women industrial workers. The city's food conservation program and the sale of war bonds were promoted by the Cuyahoga County Women's Suffrage Association. President Woodrow Wilson said that women had earned the right to vote by their efforts during the war and urged voters to pass the 19th Amendment. Cleveland women voted in their first national election in 1920. Women's groups immediately intensified their political activities. During the 1920s, the League of Women Voters, under its first president, Belle Sherwin, became a bipartisan group to teach women how to use their new rights. The Cleveland League was the first to poll candidates on issues and to publish their responses. The League continues to be in the forefront of political reform today. The Consumers League of Ohio worked to regulate child labor and to pass compulsory school attendance laws. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, women such as Elizabeth McGee and Marie Remington Wing, one of the first two women elected to City Council in 1923, worked to establish unemployment insurance and more humane relief measures. During World War II, Rosie the Riveter became a byword for the contribution of women in making America the arsenal for democracy. Large numbers of Cleveland women entered heavy industry to build tanks for the war. Women also volunteered for the Red Cross, rolling bandages and knitting sweaters, but unlike earlier efforts during the Civil War and World War I, no outstanding female organizational leaders emerged. Indeed, the roles formerly filled by women's voluntary organizations were performed by government agencies mainly staffed by men. But inroads were being made on the political front. Jean Muriel Capers became the first black woman city council person in the U.S. in 1949. She remained in city council for 10 years. In 1977, she became a municipal judge. Feminism was quiescent until the 1960s, paralleling the civil rights movement as women began to question traditional roles. Cleveland's women's movement played a major role as Ohio became one of the first states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment after Congress passed it in 1970. Yet it was not ratified by a sufficient number of states, and in 1996, women are still not protected by the United States Constitution. The Cleveland Business and Professional Women's Club and the League of Women Voters helped strike down Ohio laws protecting women from difficult and unsafe working conditions, which were now seen as holding women back with their restrictive clauses. In sharp contrast to 1896, 56% of students now attending universities are women. Employment opportunities have vastly increased, but women graduates still encounter prejudice and restrictions at the higher echelons. In 1975, Women's Space was founded to form a coalition of women groups in existence at that time: the Rape Crisis Center, Cleveland Women's Counseling, the YWCA, the NOW, and Cleveland Women Working. It became a model for the entire country and later helped establish Women Together, one of the first shelters for battered women and their children in the U.S. We of 1996, like you of 1896, love our country and seek its prosperity and perpetuity. In your century, your men marched to victory in 3 great wars. You were ready to defend our country against all the world. In our century, we have fought 2 world wars and many smaller ones. Not just our men, but also our women have served and died in our country's armed forces. You wrote that your 100 years have given the world the locomotive and the steamboat, the telegraph, telephone, photograph, electric lights, and the electric motor. You ask if we have invented a flying machine or found the North Pole. As a matter of fact, we have invented a flying machine. It is commonplace for millions of people to fly on business and for pleasure to all corners of the world. And we have found the North Pole. And not just the North Pole of the Earth, but also the North Poles of the planets Venus and Mars and of our Sun. We have walked on the Moon and landed spacecraft on other planets. We have sent machines beyond the confines of the solar system itself, and women have helped as engineers and as explorers. Our century has given the world many things you probably never dared to imagine. Childhood diseases, measles, mumps, polio, and many others have been virtually eliminated through inoculations. Antibiotics now cure many illnesses, even the dreaded tuberculosis. At the push of a button, we can suck dirt out of our carpets, wash our clothes and dishes, and cook our food. Theater and music come through the air into our living rooms. We have thinking machines that teach our children to read, balance our checkbooks, and send letters and pictures to friends all over the world electronically. With a very few exceptions, the young women of today are bound only by the limits of their own ambition. Just as Judy Resnick has blazed the path for our city's young women to follow into Cleveland's 3rd century, many women of Cleveland's 2nd century laid the groundwork for our own accomplishments. Mary Spargo, who in 1885 was the first woman admitted to the Bar Association. Hazel Mountain Walker, one of the first African American women admitted to the practice of law in Ohio and first African American to serve as a Cleveland school principal. Adela Prentice Hughes, musical impresario, founder of the world-renowned Cleveland Orchestra. Florence Allen, first woman Ohio Supreme Court Judge, 1922. Dorothy Doan Henry, first chief of the Women's Bureau of the Cleveland Police Department in 1924. Linda Eastman, director of the Cleveland Public Library during its 1925 expansion to Superior Avenue. Mercedes Kottner, appointed to City Council in 1954, subsequent winner of 5 elections, then Clerk of Council from 1964 until 1989. Mary Boyle, first woman Cuyahoga County Commissioner, 1984. Stephanie Tubbs Jones, first African American woman to serve as Cuyahoga County Prosecutor. Ruth Miller, president of Tower City Enterprises, who beautified downtown Cleveland with lighting the Terminal Tower. These are just some of the things we've done over the past 100 years, dear women of 1896.
Now we would like to ask you, the women of Cleveland of 2096, what have you done? Did you go to college on the moon? Have you discovered a cure for cancer? Do you still grow old? Did you ever run for president? Did you win? What are you doing for the people that live in Cleveland?